And it says, and Adonai speaking to Moses, saying, speaking to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman had conceived seed and born a man, so born a son, a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days according to the days of separation for infirmary. She shall be unclean. Now, one thing that I would like to see in the modern world, one thing that this is one of the most misconceived, even in the leprosy, that it starts discussing in this portion. So modern translations, because it goes into the particular portion, the ritual after childbirth and the law for, unclean disease, law concerning garments and purification. And really, modern eyes would look and say, that is barbaric. What are you doing? That is insane. But a thing to take into consideration was this was during the times of the temple and God's dwelling with the people, just the intensity of that dwelling. So it's truly not a thing of uncleanliness like we perceive it. It's not about shame. It's not about guilt. Actually, the word sinner, if you look at the original translation, the word sinner is not in the Torah. There's one that has had a lapse of judgment and has committed sin, but there's no one that is written off as being a waste of human life. Every life is sacred. And that's why it says if a woman conceives and gives birth, it shares a root with the word for seed. And, again, we're all created in God's image. Everybody that comes into this world has a piece of that within them. It's to be cherished. And really these laws are about confronting life, and confronting life and death. And it's about the sanctity of life. And even with the temple sacrifices, understanding life and death and understanding that God is one with that. Another thing that's, it goes into the circumcision. And I was reading, because I like to just look at the history of things. So circumcision is on the 8th day. And this was an ancient process, right? But I was reading something about newborns just today, and I printed it out. It says, by the 8th day, the newborn has adapted to the extrauterine environment, making the immune system more robust during the first few days of life. So the 8th day is actually according to, they look at vitamin K levels, for blood clotting and everything. The 8th day is the perfect day for circumcision. And I thought that was interesting because, this is modern medicine has really yet to completely catch up with that was ancient, that always existed. Like I said, I thought that was really interesting to see that that's considered the perfect time to do this. And really, when Scripture talks about circumcision of the heart, it's better to have your heart changed at a youthful age than when you wait till you're up in years, because it's hard to change your ways. You get stuck in your ways. You get stubborn. You get really, really hard-headed, and you get really cold and calloused. When you bounce down, I'll read a couple more verses. And verse 6 says, and the days of her purifying are fulfilled, for a son or daughter she shall bring a lamb of the first year, burnt offering, a young pigeon, a turtle dove, for a sin offering, unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, unto the priest. Offer it before Adonai, and make it atonement for her. She shall be cleansed from the issue of blood. Again, it's about the sanctity of life. It's not saying that she is unclean, or it's not saying that the sin offering, it's not saying that birth is a sin. That's a misconception. And, it is true. When you read things in English, and I know not everybody wants to really go sit down, I encourage everybody to get a Strong's Concordance. But when you read it in Hebrew, especially these scriptures, because that's where it comes from. It comes from the Hebrew. It reads differently than the English translations. And I'll get into that in the next portion. But the number 8 is a very interesting number because you think about an infinity symbol. Those you used to see those all the time. It's like a number 8. Notice the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, 8 days. 8 is always about renewal, and it's about life, about God's eternal provision. 8th day is it's traditionally known as a day that's chosen to blend, obedience and divine command. It's birth and continuance of life, and that's why you have celebrations on the 8th day, and it's linked to purity and being brought before God. And in Leviticus 8, in the previous, remember the 8th day is a time when the animal is first acceptable for sacrifice. So 7 is the completion, of creation, and 8 is like that next step beyond. It's like a cycle, continuing to go. I heard a joke. I was actually reading a commentary on this. It was talking about why does the woman have to bring a sin offering after the birth. And there was actually a rabbi speaking to another rabbi, and he said, well, you didn't hear the way my wife talked when she was giving labor. It makes some sense. But, really it signifies a lot going on. 8th is a new beginning. Right after the standard, Noah was the 8th person to be saved in his family to start a new world. So, there's a lot going on there. But really what was interesting to me, and I guess we won't keep this too long tonight, but this is a very interesting portion of Scripture. But it says on chapter 13, and Adonai spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh rising a scab or bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy, they shall be brought to Aaron the high priest and one of his sons the priest, and shall look on the plague and the skin of the flesh, and when the hair of the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it's the plague of leprosy, the priest shall look at him and pronounce him unclean. Now, leprosy is a mistranslation here. Really, when you look at, because the word is Tzarat, T-Z-A-R-A-A-T, Tzarat. And so this was an illness that was brought upon by evil speech, called Lashon Hara. And, so when I speak unclean of somebody, remember what happened to the sister of Moses? Remember she had leprosy? Same word is used. So it's not the leprosy that we know necessarily of when we think leprosy. It's speech that has been spoken ill of someone. And it would affect the person's skin, but also could affect their garments, their belongings. Actually, in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, you see this same thing reoccurring, and you see it throughout the scriptures, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where they're speaking ill of someone, and then it starts to affect. And really, that's a deeper lesson in there, because our words, what we say, really affects our reality. And this chapter actually echoed something that's been going on in my own personal life. Not that I've been intentionally speaking unclean, but I got to thinking about people and people that really have peace. Because sometimes I have anxiety, and I struggle with that sometimes. I struggle with sleeping, and I really envy the person that can just lay their head on that pillow and go to sleep, because I cannot. I'm up 2, 3 in the morning, and you're like, well, how do you get that? Because my mind races. I'm thinking about little things or people I haven't seen in 20 years or books I've read and trying to critique it in my head. But, you think about the time and energy we spend, it really dawned on me. I said it's sad that this had to occur to me in my 30s. But how much time do we spend envisioning the good outcomes? We spend so much time worrying about being sick and worrying about death and worrying about family issues and worrying about money. And people that are really genuinely successful never seem to think about that. People that I know in business and people that I know in certain, they never think about, it's like Granny used to say, your worst fears never come into fruition. How much time, and something that's really helped my life recently is I stop, I pray, but I also meditate on the things I want. I put that as a mental image. If I want a certain thing, then I think about it and I speak it. And there is power in that. Point in place, I've had several phone calls of good phone calls, whether it be related to people need me to play somewhere or, work-related things. I've had some good fruit of that because what we put out there, our life is, our reality, we do create it. When I was not living right, I used to get upset with Dad because he would say, son, life is what you make it. You're just being negative. Turns out he was right. I was being very negative and I was creating a negative life. But with this leprosy, the skin disease, it would appear in different places, and the priest would look upon them, and there was a purification process. So you think about it. In Isaiah 53, most people, especially in the Christian church, have heard the term leper Messiah, how he bore the iniquities, bore the affliction, bore these things upon him. The issue with that evil speech is it causes who you're speaking of to suffer too, because their image, the perception, people are looking. Think about how gossip ruins things. Think about how in a small town, the right person can say the wrong thing about you and people believe it. And I have encountered people that, it's like we were talking about some things earlier. You meet people and you're thinking, wow, geez, this is a nice person. Everybody else said you were an axe murderer. That's the way they made it out to be. And so they were so close to dwelling with God in these days. They were so close to the source that there was no room for evil speech. It was all about the sanctity of life. And there was no room for gossip, no room for... I mean, think about how social media and most people's cell phones would cause this form of leprosy widespread these days, because it would come from evil speech. Because Scripture warns that who you're speaking evil of, not only does it hurt you, but it causes the object of that. It's not, words are not to be taken lightly. Words are serious. We don't need to say anything we don't mean. And that's why I was talking with another gentleman he's a minister of himself, and I like the way he put it. He said, I believe in free speech, but what I believe in more than free speech is responsible speech. Responsible speech. Because that's what the Scriptures teach. We live in a world, especially with AI, people can just say anything, do anything, lies get spread. If the same thing was still going, if the temple were standing now and the same application was still being applied, you would see a many a homes, a many a garment, and a many a body with this illness, because people speak negatively every day. So just something to think about. Also, the way life, and in chapter 12, thinking about how life and the purity afterwards. That you think about blood, the life, the soul in the blood. Sometimes when we go through moments where we have to encounter the sanctity of life, when we go through death, because notice it goes into touching a dead body, or touching, when we encounter the sanctity of life, when we encounter something that God has taken away, it's like I mentioned over the weekend, our time, what we give our time to, reveals what we worship, and time is a gift that God gives us. So until we give that time back, we will never truly realize, what we're here for. We'll never realize our purpose. When you go through moments, when you have the sanctity of life, like when you lose someone, say you were to lose a spouse, touch the body thereof, it is good sometimes to have a break and just to dwell with God. That's what this cleansing and purification is really about, is taking time to reflect on the sanctity of life and the seriousness of life and the love and the beauty and the deepness of life. It was never a thing with shame or scorn. So modern readings and modern eyes make you think that, but it really wasn't. When you study culturally and historically and really look at the Scriptures, it was taking time to pray, to get right, to realize, that God is one, that God is there, that He is with us. Because there's an interesting passage about this leprosy. It said that, if it reached to the point to where their entire body was covered in this, then they were considered they were pardoned, essentially. So you think about that. Why? Because everything has been revealed at that point. Because it was like a gift. And how do you call the skin illness a gift? Because God was giving this, it was showing up before it got out of hand. And it was allowing us because sometimes we can't see how negative and how angry and how hateful we're being until somebody lets us know. And so when you think about that, it manifested itself. And, immediately they were to go to a priest. So it created a sense of urgency, to go to the priest, because if not, it's going to get worse. Imagine if we corrected all the problems in our life with that sense of urgency. When I start to have aught against my neighbor, because again, Mark 9 would be the scripture that correlates to this from a New Testament standpoint. If your hand is bothering you and causing you to go into, whether you see Gehenna or hell, cut it off. It's better to enter into this life and live a life of love without that hand than to, go into hell with two, is what he says in Mark 9. So think about that. If we would correct our hatred and the things that bother us and the things that are just really messing up, the anxiety, the depression, the thing that's causing us to speak evil of life and ourselves and others, if we correct it instantly, think about how much better the world will be. So it's really a gift. And to understand Scripture as God being one, you have to look at it that way. After a week, they'd be checked again after it arises. And, if the disease had spread, then, again, there's more things to work upon. And total isolation from the rest of the community so they had to live and separate, and they had to cry out. Think about it. Prideful people, because what causes people to speak ill of others? Pride and ego. Imagine if our political leaders, if this were still around, like even our president, many times he should keep his mouth shut. Imagine if Donald Trump came down with this disease and had to cry out, unclean, unclean. It would lower him, lower the ego. And that's really what it's about is, God always desires humility, mercy. He said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Humility, mercy, and love. So all the people that really say things they shouldn't, think about it. It's a blessing. If this would occur today, there'd be people that, very successful people would go through this, and they would be lowered a notch. And there's some that need that in our world today. And you see it other times, like in 2 Kings, you see it in Leviticus 13, you see it in 2 Kings 5, you see it in Numbers, you see it in 2 Chronicles 16, Leviticus 19, you also see it in James 4, Matthew 12. So it's all over the place. It's not just in the cautions against negative speech is a very serious thing in Scripture. And I thought about Matthew 15, where it says, are you without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatsoever entereth at the mouth goeth into the belly, what's cast into the draught? But those things which proceed from the mouth, come from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, and it goes into false witness. Think about the things that we let go out here, and it really affects us. And again, that's not talking about, I touched on the food laws last week. That's not talking about, that all food at that point were considered clean. What he is saying is what's coming out here is it's resonating with all of your being. That's why they say don't speak ill of yourself, because you're speaking that to your mind. I know people that have a bad problem insulting themselves, and they call themselves stupid. They call themselves dumb. Working in mental health, we see it all the time, and people are their own worst enemy. So imagine if no one did that. Imagine if God corrected that in our life from the time it wouldn't be a habit. I know adults. I met a gentleman a few weeks back at an event I was at, and it just hit him like he almost had a breakdown because I said something. It wasn't even anything bad. We're just joking, but it triggered a childhood memory, and his father was so apparently abusive that this man has beat himself up for 60-something years. So if we were truly punished for our ill speech, our lashon hara, as in the Hebrew puts it, the world would be a better place because people would not speak ill as they want to at times. And also think about it, the sins that were most likely to have caused the condition, gossip, murder, pride, arrogance, envy, derogatory speech, they required others to participate in. When you separate them, they have to look at themselves, and we have to be alone with God and address what is wrong, what's going on with their hearts. It's the same thing that Miriam was afflicted with because she spoke against Moses' wife. So it's a serious thing. That especially, something that I always encourage more people to think about. And it goes through the cleansing of these things. They had to participate and be clean before they can go into the temple. And again, like I said, I thought of Isaiah 53, which is referring to Israel as the suffering servant, his people, that just the bearing of iniquities and the things that they've had to go through because of choosing to operate in things that, choosing to dwell in the negative. And again, that's why they refer to as, the Messiah being like the leper Messiah, the least expected. And in today's world, it is interesting that he's misunderstood by the Christian church, misunderstood by the other religions. God will one day God will reveal the truth about his son to the world. And that's part of the hope of faith. So a lot going on there. And, it's a spiritual mirror, the leprosy. And verse 12 says, leprosy break out abroad in the skin, or cover all the skin, or him that hath the plague from his head, even to his foot. It says, then the priest shall consider him, behold, it have covered all his flesh, and pronounce him clean. That sounds ironic, doesn't it? He's got a plague all over his flesh, but he's clean now. Why? Because every bit of that evil that he was letting proceed is now, it's all revealed. It's all about dark coming to light and all things being exposed. So everything that was in his inner being or her inner being that was needed cleansing is now brought to the surface. And so it's a lot more supernatural than we really think of it. And that was a new take to me as well. So it's a lot about how the spiritual mirror of life is. And again, life is a precious thing, and that's really what this entire Leviticus is about, the sanctity of life, and how what we can't see controls what we can. And, the role of the priest. Remember in last week's portion, there was a debate between Moses and Aaron. And Moses was known as the humble prophet because Moses was wrong. And he was willing to admit he was wrong after it was revealed. And that's when the Aaronic priesthood was made for eternity, admitting our wrongs and living a life of humility. And the role of the priest was to see beyond the surface, to discern. I thought about today, the world during the time of Noah and how differently that would look, and similar problems, but just the closer we are in the spiritual things, light is too much for some people, and people go the wrong directions with things. But just the bigger problems is the world was so much more spiritual back then, and sadly, again, people took it in the wrong direction. But it's about spiritual perception. It's not about a medical issue as much as spiritual perception and understanding impurity, being declared pure. And that's why the priest was trained to look for holiness. And verse 51 says here to look on the plague, and the seventh day if the plague be spread in the garment, either in his warp or in the woof or in the skin or any work that is made with the skin, the plague is fretting. It's a fretting leprosy. It is unclean. So again, it's an ongoing process. Verification. 14 goes over the cleansing laws of the leper. But the goal, and here's where the mercy of God is to be considered. The goal was always returning life and returning to community. You think about today, there's people that do crimes in the state of Georgia, 3 strikes you're out. You can be a nonviolent drug offender and spend the rest of your life in state prison, separated from all your family, and never have hurt a soul. That's not what the Torah is about. It's about reintegrating. It's about cleansing. It's about bringing people back to life. It's, living water, and even the things that were used for the purification ritual, there was hyssop, there was, cedar wood, there's a crimson thread, representing the sin, representing the different things that's going on. So think about that. It's all, life is about awareness, discipline and reverence for God. That's why in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he said, it's all vanity. I had wealth, I had wives, I had all the things. It's all vanity. One day he said, everybody's going to forget me and forget you too. What matters is that we fear God, fear our Creator. And this is true. Many a modern reader is going to feel uncomfortable reading a lot of this stuff because we're looking at it through modern eyes. But Ecclesiastes 3:11, God made everything beautiful in its time. So it's not about punishment, it's about return. And that's really what I thought about when I was reading this. And it says later in Leviticus 18, keep my laws and my statutes, which a person shall do and live by them. Notice it doesn't say die by them. It says live by them. Live by them, not die by them. Live by them, because we choose life. Keeping his instruction is choosing life. He tells you, I'll prolong your days if you do what I tell you. And it's just like a lot of the things with the food. In the previous portion, it went into not eating pork. When you look at especially back then, and even today, but like it carries the highest amount of parasites. It's a lot of the bottom feeders, things are going to have the toxins. God knows how he created, he knows what he made everything for, so he just gives us this map. But a lot of it is about obedience without truly knowing, and we figure it out. We'll understand it eventually. But what we really get from all this is that every human life has a divine image, and every word, what you say, what you do, is not in vain. It matters. That's why we need to speak God's love. That's why the church, I never like it when preachers and things, their whole sermon is insulting other groups of people. I see so much hate online, people wishing death on others, and people wishing, if people would realize that all the children of Abraham are serving the same God, like Allah is just another, Allah means God just like our God, but you see all this hate in the world, and it really breaks my heart because it comes from that pride. They don't realize that. And peace would be more existing, I feel like, if people were just transparent and would seek love. Imagine if we never said anything but the best to people. You know, the world will be a different place. And he says in like 19 too, you know, be holy for I, Lord your God, am holy. Holiness is not going to be found by escaping life. It's going to be found by living life. It's the only way we receive it. That's just what I wanted to share.